Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
When I was 18 years old, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, the kind of evening where the air felt heavy with expectation, as though the world itself was about to shift under my feet. I can still see the way my mother kept stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved, the spoon clinking against the ceramic like a nervous metronome, while my father leaned back in his chair with the posture of someone about to deliver bad news in the most casual way possible. They told me that college just wasn't in the budget, that the economy was hard, that they had tried, but the numbers didn't add up, and that as much as they wished things were different, I would have to figure it out. I remember laughing nervously at first, thinking maybe they were joking, because every conversation we'd had leading up to that moment had been about applications, acceptance letters, and dorm rooms. But no, their faces stayed serious, and the silence between their words was suffocating. It was humiliating to call the school I had dreamed about and tell them I couldn't attend because the money wasn't there. I had friends packing up their cars, posting pictures of their dorm keys, bragging about orientation week, while I was left scrambling, applying for every scholarship and grant I could find, praying that someone out there would think I was worth investing in. I got lucky with a partial scholarship at a state university and picked up 2 part-time jobs to cover the rest. My parents clapped and said they were proud of me for being resourceful, but even then, I could see the shadow of disappointment in their eyes, the quiet implication that maybe I should have chosen something practical, something less expensive, something easier on them. Meanwhile, my brother Jason, 2 years younger, was already being groomed like a golden calf. He coasted through high school with mediocre grades, but my parents were convinced he was destined for greatness. They talked about his charm, his natural leadership, the way he would grow into a man who carried the family name with pride. At family dinners, the conversation always seemed to circle back to Jason, while I was left describing how many hours I had picked up at the coffee shop or how much I still owed on textbooks. I told myself I didn't mind, that I was tougher, that I didn't need the same kind of validation. Still, it stung, and it carved into me like a reminder that I was the spare part in their little machine, useful when necessary, but never the center of attention. The truth cracked open one afternoon when I came home for the weekend. I was grabbing something from the kitchen counter when I noticed my mother's checkbook lying open, a half-written stub peeking out from beneath a pile of mail. I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity burned hotter than guilt. What I saw stopped me cold. Tuition. Not mine. Jason's. A prep program to get him ready for law school, paid in full. My stomach dropped so fast it was like missing a step on a staircase. I closed the book quickly, but the numbers had already etched themselves into my brain. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the audacity, the ease with which they had lied straight to my face while opening their wallets for him without hesitation. For the rest of that visit, I studied my parents like strangers. My father reading the paper in the living room, my mother humming while folding laundry, ordinary movements that now felt poisoned. They had let me break my back working double shifts, had watched me struggle to pay for gas and groceries, had smiled and told me they admired my independence, all while quietly investing in Jason's future as though mine was disposable. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my chest burning with a mixture of anger and something deeper, something closer to grief. It was the moment I realized the game had always been rigged, that I was never meant to win in their eyes. But here's the part they didn't see coming. I didn't confront them, didn't blow up or demand answers. Instead, I made a decision in silence. If they wanted to play favorites, fine, I would play my own game. I threw myself even harder into my studies, applying for internships, networking with professors, quietly building a future that didn't need their approval or their money. And when I landed a scholarship that covered nearly all of my tuition for the next 2 years, I didn't tell them. I smiled politely when they asked how I was managing, let them assume I was still scraping by. In reality, I was stacking bricks of independence, one careful choice at a time. Still, every time I picked up another shift at the coffee shop or dragged myself out of bed before dawn to study, the bitterness simmered. It grew in the quiet moments, when I compared my patched-together life with Jason's smooth road paved by our parents' checkbook. They wanted him to be the lawyer, the golden boy, the family pride. Maybe he would be. But I knew then that I would never forget that first betrayal, that moment at the kitchen table when they looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't worth it. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't kill you right away, it lingers, settling into your bones, reshaping the way you see the world. And I knew this was only the beginning. Because if my parents could justify lying to me once, I had no doubt they would do it again. I just didn't know yet how far they were willing to go, or how much it would cost them in the end. And that's where the first thread of revenge began to weave itself quietly into my story, though they wouldn't see it until much later. For now, I played the dutiful daughter, nodding along at family dinners, pretending not to notice when Jason smirked and my parents beamed at him like he had already changed the world. But deep down, I was keeping score. And sooner or later, they would learn what it felt like to have someone close the door on them and walk away without looking back. The summer my brother packed for law school, the house turned into a parade route with cardboard boxes as floats and my parents as the marching band, conducting each detail with a level of excitement I had not seen since kindergarten graduations and Little League trophies. While I stood in the doorway holding a laundry basket and pretending I didn't notice the stack of brand new suit bags draped over the couch like flags marking territory that never belonged to me. My mother kept saying this was a season of change, a blessing, a family victory, and my father, who never gushed, somehow found endless ways to repeat that investing in Jason's potential was the smart move, because the law would pay back someday. Because prestige mattered, because this was how families moved forward in the world, and he even joked that a future judge in the family might finally make our last name mean something at the country club, which landed like a paper cut I couldn't stop poking. On the day we caravanned to the city for orientation, I drove behind the rented moving truck and watched my parents' SUV sway with the weight of boxed ambition, and in those long highway miles I tried to talk myself into feeling happy for him. Because that's what decent sisters do. They clap and deliver snacks and tape up boxes and say things like, "You've got this," while swallowing the memory of a kitchen table meeting where the budget fell apart only for me, and the absurdity of it all started to taste metallic in my mouth, like the aftertaste of a cheap penny you accidentally lick as a kid. The apartment near campus smelled like drywall and new beginnings, and as we hauled in coffee makers and an espresso machine more expensive than my first semester books, my mother made a ceremony of placing color-coded folders on Jason's desk with schedules, contacts, and a check tucked into the back sleeve for surprises, and I thought about the times I counted coins in my apron pocket after closing the coffee shop, praying they would cover bus fare and a week of oatmeal packets. At dinner that night, the restaurant hummed with the kind of energy that makes people lift their chins a little higher, all polished wood and confident laughter, and when the waiter brought a bottle the price of my car insurance, my father raised his glass to the future counselor, while my mother squeezed my wrist and whispered that none of this meant they loved me any less, which would have been a comfort if love paid interest or knocked a cent off tuition. Jason basked like a cat in a slant of sunlight, charming even the waiter with a story about moot court and mock trials he hadn't yet attended, and when he smirked at me over dessert and said, not unkindly but with the softness that always carried a sting, that some people are wired for the grind while others are wired for the climb, I laughed too loudly and said I was happy to be the grind, because at least the grind keeps the lights on. I returned to my shared apartment that night and set my alarm for a pre-dawn shift, and as the coffee machines roared like airplanes and the line of commuters grew, I thought about how American dreams are often built on who gets spotted early and who gets told to be scrappy, and how scrappy can become a personality trait if you let it calcify around your ribs. When my parents called later that week, their voices were thick with pride as they recapped orientation, the dean's remarks, and the networking brunch that sounded like a costume party where everyone dressed as their futures, and then, almost as an afterthought, they mentioned a tiny hiccup with their mortgage because they had front-loaded some of Jason's moving costs. Nothing dramatic, just a bridge to stability, and could I spot them for a couple months since I was so independent and so good with money, which is the kind of flattery that smells like gasoline right before someone hands you a match. I said yes, because the words slid off my tongue before my pride could slam the door, and they exhaled in relief and told me I was a lifesaver, the backbone, the one who kept things steady while big moves happened. And when I hung up, I stared at the transfer screen on my banking app and thought about the difference between being useful and being valued, how one buys dinner and the other buys a future, and how I had spent years confusing the two. The money left my account with a tiny, cheerful chime that felt like mockery, and I sat there in the quiet, letting the anger rise and settle, until it started shaping itself into something with edges, a tool instead of a wound. The next morning, I called my loan servicer, the one whose hold music I knew by heart, and I made a payment that shaved months off my principal, a quiet reallocation that tasted like oxygen after a long dive. And when my mother texted a heart and a thank you and a photo of Jason holding a set of engraved pens my father had bought him for his first day, I replied with a thumbs up and the lie that the transfer might take a few days to clear because my bank sometimes moved like molasses. I went to work and poured lattes with an almost ridiculous level of care because precision steadied my hands and reminded me I had control over at least one corner of my life, and at closing time I stood in the doorway, breathing in the smell of roasted beans and bleach, and I promised myself that every dollar that left my hands from now on would be a vote for my own future, even if I had to smile while people mistook that discipline for selfishness. A week later, my father called sounding cheerful, and then puzzled, and then a little embarrassed, asking if I had typed the routing number wrong. Nothing to panic about, just a minor delay they were sure would sort itself out. And I apologized with the practiced calm of a customer service script while watching the confirmation email from my lender blink on my screen like a lighthouse, and in that moment I felt a flicker of satisfaction, not loud or cruel, just steady, like the hum of a machine finally tuned to the right frequency. I hung up and sat in the late afternoon light that turned my kitchen the color of old honey, and I wondered how long it would take before they realized that the person they called independent had understood the assignment a little too well. That loyalty without reciprocity is just unpaid labor with better branding, and that I had quietly chosen a different job description. By the time Jason posted a photo of his orientation badge with a caption about legacies and first steps, the comment section filled with relatives calling him a natural, and my mother added a line about family sacrifice, which made me laugh so hard I had to sit down, not because it was funny, but because the audacity of it felt like a magic trick performed right under my nose, and while the hearts stacked up beneath their words, I drafted a polite message to my landlord confirming that my next rent would be early, not late, because there is no sweeter revenge than stability purchased on your own terms, even if no one claps for it. And as the night settled and my phone buzzed again with my father's number, I let it ring, counting each vibration like a metronome, aware that something had shifted, that my yes had become a lever I could pull in only one direction, and that the next conversation would not end where they expected, because I had finally learned how to move the pieces without telling anyone which game we were playing. The first time I understood that the story I had been telling myself about fairness was not just naive, but actively dangerous was the afternoon I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a box of old books and found the dining table transformed into a command center. Papers fanned out in crisp little rows, highlighters bleeding neon confidence into the margins, with my mother perched at the head like a project manager and my father slowly tapping a calculator he did not actually need because every figure had already been decided, and when I asked what the operation was this time, my mother said they were organizing education records for the family and gestured at a folder with my name on it as though that should comfort me. Which it did for exactly half a second until I opened it and realized the folder contained statements from an account my grandparents had opened when I was a child, an account I had heard about in hushed, proud tones at every Thanksgiving. The fund meant for me. The one my grandfather, who sold hardware and saved like it was a sport, used to call my launch pad, and there on the ledger were transfers labeled tuition disbursement, followed by the law school's name and dates that aligned perfectly with Jason's first year. I remember feeling the way you do when the final piece of a magic trick is revealed and you cannot decide whether to clap or vomit, because the theft was not just financial, it was narrative, a rewriting of family memory disguised as practicality. And my mother, seeing my face harden, launched into a speech so rehearsed I could have set a metronome to it, explaining that Grandpa would have wanted the money to go where it could make the most difference, that it would be wasted on my major, that legacies are built by the family's strongest branch, and the branch in question needed water now, not later, and my father, trying for gentle, added that I was already doing so well on my own that using the fund for me would have been redundant, as though independence were a reason to be cut out rather than a reason to be trusted. I stood there with the statements in my hand and watched my parents congratulate each other for their strategic thinking, and it occurred to me with painful clarity that they had been planning this for years. Not because they were villains in a melodrama, but because they had quietly absorbed a rule about daughters and sons that they would never admit out loud, a rule that sorted us into categories of promising and capable, investment and self-sustaining. And the knowledge settled over me like cold smoke, stinging my eyes while leaving everything else unbearably clear. Jason breezed in then with his new briefcase and a story about a study group that sounded more like a fraternity rush, and when he saw the folder in my hands he grinned and said Grandpa would be proud that the money was finally doing something real, which he said with the easy cruelty of someone who has never once wondered how the bills would be paid, and I replied that the money had been doing something real for as long as it existed. It had been making a promise, and he flashed that practiced shrug that means nothing sticks to me because I am coated in parental Teflon. I left before the conversation turned into a scene, and as I walked to my car I could feel the adrenaline thudding in my neck, a drumline of anger keeping time with a rising, focused clarity that felt like stepping into a room where the lights finally worked. And I decided that if they could treat me like an external vendor for the family enterprise, then I would start acting like one, which meant renegotiating terms, narrowing exposure, and assigning risk appropriately, not out of spite. Although there was plenty of that, but out of the kind of discipline you develop when you are done being the soft landing for other people's leaps. That night, I pulled files from the back of my closet and sat cross-legged on the floor with my laptop, and I went through every policy, every account, every form where my parents' names appeared by habit rather than by necessity, and I began to erase them, replacing emergency contacts with my own number and a trusted friend who answers the phone, updating beneficiary designations on the modest retirement account I had been building $5 at a time, removing the "in case of emergency" call mom from medical portals that now reflected a different reality, and as I clicked confirm, I felt a small internal lock slide into place. A boundary becoming real not because I announced it, but because paperwork is the language bureaucracies understand, and I decided I would speak it fluently. In the days that followed, I moved my checking to a credit union that knew my name without checking a script, set up alerts that sang out whenever a large request hit my credit report, and placed a freeze that made impulsive co-signing impossible even if someone tried to use my details in the name of family urgency. And when my mother called to ask if I could help Jason secure a short-term line for a bar prep course because the rate was unfair for someone so promising, I listened to the pitch with the patience of a customer hearing the extended warranty offer, then told her I was not available for guarantor duties this season and would not be in future seasons either, and the silence on the other end ballooned until it felt like a pressure change. And I realized she had never imagined the door could swing shut the other way. For a moment I questioned myself, because that is the reflex trained into daughters who can lift more than their share without complaint. And I thought about Grandpa's calm hands counting bills at the kitchen table and wondered what he would say about the way the fund had been redirected, about promises unkept and expectations repackaged. And then I remembered the twinkle in his eye when he told me to keep receipts, which I had, not only of purchases but of conversations, of statements of the ledger of respect, and I felt the doubt recede like a tide finally giving back the shore. When I finally slept, I dreamed of the house keys I had surrendered and the doors they had once opened, and in the morning I woke to a text from Jason with a selfie taken in a library that probably smelled like mahogany and ambition, captioned with something about destiny and grind, and I typed a polite response that said good luck and meant Godspeed to whatever lesson is coming, because I suspected it would arrive sooner than he expected, maybe as a bill, maybe as a result, maybe as a mirror. And as I hit send, I realized that my revenge, for now, required nothing theatrical, only the steady practice of choosing myself on paper and in practice, which is harder to celebrate on social media but devastatingly effective in real life. And when my phone lit up with my father's name and then went dark again, I let the call die in the quiet confidence that the next time I answered, it would be on terms that did not bend, because I had finally learned that love without boundaries is just a discount code everyone keeps trying at checkout, and my system now returned an error by default, even if they believed they were entitled to permanent access. By the time I graduated, the accumulation of years spent managing my own finances, navigating the labyrinth of scholarships, student loans, and part-time jobs, and watching the delicate choreography of my parents' favoritism toward Jason, had transformed into something hard-edged, a clarity that cut through the guilt and doubt I had carried like hidden stones in my pockets. And the first day I walked across the stage to accept my diploma, feeling the weight of independence in the velvet folds of my gown and the cheers of my peers echoing through the auditorium, I understood in a visceral way that the life I had built was mine alone, painstakingly crafted from every ounce of effort that no one had acknowledged. A testament to resilience I could finally measure against the invisible standard of parental approval I had once craved and now had no intention of seeking. Returning home for a family dinner after the ceremony, I noticed the subtle adjustments my parents made as though rehearsing for an audience that might never arrive. The napkins folded precisely, the wine decanted with ritual precision, and Jason, beaming as if the accolades were his own, chattered about a mock trial he had attended, the kind of victory lap they had been preparing for him since he first mastered tying his shoes without supervision, and I could feel the tension pooling beneath my ribcage because the world had been neatly arranged for him, as if my accomplishments were merely a prelude, a warm-up act before the main performance. And the more I listened, the more I realized that the lesson they were teaching, knowingly or not, was that loyalty to family meant subsidizing the privileged, that fairness was a rhetorical flourish, and that I was meant to remain the responsible adult in a story that celebrated everyone else. The conversation inevitably shifted to Jason's bar exam prep course, a topic my parents approached with the urgency of a corporate merger and the casual entitlement of someone discussing weekend plans, and when my father asked, in a tone that implied both trust and expectation, if I could contribute to the tuition because he and my mother had already stretched every resource imaginable, I realized that this was the culmination of a pattern that had been developing for years. A deliberate positioning of me as the financial cushion for the brother whose every whim had been anticipated and funded without hesitation. And in that moment, sitting at the head of the table while the chandelier reflected a kaleidoscope of light across my carefully composed expression, I felt the full weight of my decision crystallize. I would participate in this family economy no longer. Not as a silent enabler, and certainly not as someone to be manipulated by guilt or obligation. My response was measured, deliberate, a polite articulation of boundaries that concealed the satisfaction simmering beneath, because I had learned that the most effective revenge is not always immediate or conspicuous, but strategic, calculated, and, above all, irreversible. I explained that while I understood the importance of education and the significance of Jason's ambitions, my own financial stability required that I refrain from contributing to expenses that had already been distributed. Preferentially, and as I spoke, I watched the subtle shifts in my parents' posture, the way their eyes flicked to each other with a mixture of disbelief and irritation, as if the idea that I could assert autonomy without shame was a new variable they had not accounted for in their lifelong spreadsheet of family obligations. Later, in the quiet of my apartment, I reviewed the series of choices that had led to this point, the scholarships I had fought for, the hours of labor I had invested, the careful stewardship of every account, every transfer. Every financial detail that ensured my independence could withstand attempts at co-option, and I marveled at the irony that while my parents had engineered a life for Jason that seemed gilded and effortless, the meticulous planning and resilience I had cultivated had rendered me immune to the very manipulations they had perfected, and I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction, knowing that the leverage had shifted. That the person they had assumed would always acquiesce was now in control of the narrative and the resources, and that the consequences of this shift would ripple through future interactions whether they acknowledged it or not. The following week, at another family gathering where Jason recounted his latest accomplishments with the confidence of someone unaware of any resistance, I observed my parents' attempts to coax me into participating in discussions about his funding and future opportunities, their language carefully coded with praise and persuasion, and I responded with neutrality and civility, maintaining a deliberate distance while reinforcing the unspoken assertion that I was no longer a participant in this particular exchange of favors and expectations. And in the stillness that followed, I realized that the most satisfying aspect of this strategy was the quiet discomfort it introduced into their well-practiced routine. A subtle but undeniable recalibration of influence that left the power dynamic unmistakably altered. By the end of the evening, as I left the house with the crisp night air brushing against my face, I reflected on the evolution of my own agency, recognizing that every decision to claim my independence, every moment of strategic resistance, had been both a shield and a tool, and that the final act of walking away without capitulating to the repeated requests for financial intervention was not merely an assertion of autonomy, but a reclamation of respect that no amount of familial insistence could undo. And as the city lights stretched ahead of me, flickering like the faint echoes of choices made and battles quietly won, I knew that the real work of self-determination had only just begun, and that my capacity to navigate the subtle, unspoken politics of family with precision would define the contours of my future far more than any scholarship or inheritance ever could. The call came on a Sunday evening, the kind of call that feels like a summons to a courtroom you never wanted to enter, and as I answered, my father's voice, usually measured and carefully modulated, carried the faint tremor of panic. The subtle tremor of someone who had spent years believing that their careful manipulations guaranteed control, and my mother's words interjected quickly, rehearsed yet desperate, describing a crisis involving Jason, who had failed the first bar exam and was now facing the looming financial obligations of the next attempt, the tuition for preparatory courses, and a mounting stack of debts they had accrued while investing heavily in his education. And though they framed it as a temporary inconvenience, the underlying message was unmistakable. They expected me to step in once more, to supply the resources they had always withheld from me when it mattered most, as if loyalty could be purchased with a signature and generosity measured in dollars rather than principles. I listened carefully, weighing every syllable, every hesitation, every subtle inflection that betrayed the fear they rarely allowed themselves to acknowledge. And I realized in that moment that the dynamics that had defined my entire young adulthood were coming to a decisive juncture, that the opportunity for subtle, strategic revenge had matured into a moment that demanded clarity, decisiveness, and a resolution that could not be undone by pleas, guilt, or familial expectation. And I allowed myself the satisfaction of knowing that after years of careful calculation, I had positioned myself to act with the full authority of independence, financial and emotional, and that the rules had changed irrevocably in my favor. When I spoke, my tone was calm, deliberate, and unyielding, articulating the reality that I had built my life without their assistance, that I had cultivated a system of security and stability designed to withstand attempts at co-option, and that while I understood their concern for Jason, I was no longer in a position to intervene financially, to serve as the safety net they assumed I would always be. And as my words settled into the line between us, I could almost hear the shift in their expectation, the recalibration of their confidence, the uncomfortable realization that their plan for perpetual influence over my resources had encountered an immovable barrier, and I allowed a long silence to fill the space, letting the weight of that understanding settle without embellishment or apology. After the call ended, I leaned back in my chair, reflecting on the evolution of the strategy one had quietly maintained for years, every scholarship earned, every hour worked, every financial decision made with precision and foresight. And I understood that the true victory was not in dramatics, confrontation, or public acknowledgement, but in the subtle, almost invisible exertion of control over my own narrative, over the resources I had earned. and over the boundaries that now define the extent of familial obligation, and I allowed myself a private acknowledgement of triumph, tempered by the awareness that this would not erase past wounds or the lingering complexities of relationships forged under unequal treatment. But it would define the terms on which I continued to engage with the people who had once dictated them unilaterally. Later that week, at a family dinner that had been scheduled before the crisis emerged, the tension was palpable, an invisible current threading through conversation, laughter, and the clink of utensils against plates. And when Jason recounted his struggles with the bar exam in a tone that blended arrogance and frustration, my parents' eyes flicked toward me with the unspoken question of intervention, and I met their gaze with a composed neutrality, smiling politely while the reality of my decision rested heavily between us, unyielding, and I observed the subtle manifestations of surprise and irritation as they realized that their daughter, whom they had long assumed would acquiesce, had asserted authority over her own life and resources in a way that could not be undermined or circumvented. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights outside casting long reflections across the walls, I contemplated the complexity of the path I had chosen, the delicate balance between independence and connection, the strategic withdrawal that served as both shield and statement, and the lingering question of whether this act of defiance would foster resentment, reconciliation, or further distance. And I understood that the most profound revenge is not immediate satisfaction, but the transformation of circumstance such that the consequences of past inequities unfold naturally without intervention, allowing integrity and self-respect to guide the resolution. In the quiet that followed, I considered the potential approaches Jason might take, the inevitability of requests for aid that would arrive with varying degrees of desperation, and I imagined the scenarios in which I could respond, each contingent on maintaining my autonomy and honoring the years of careful stewardship I had invested in my own future. And as the night deepened and my apartment settled into stillness, I realized that the act of closing my wallet, of walking away from the automatic expectation of compliance, was not merely a financial decision, but a declaration of self-determination that would echo through every subsequent interaction, a boundary enforced with clarity and the thought of that finality, coupled with the quiet knowledge that the family's dependence on my discretion was now tempered by reality, provided a satisfaction both subtle and profound, as I understood that for the first time, I was the author of my own terms, and the narrative that had been written by favoritism, expectation, and unbalanced generosity was now irrevocably rewritten, leaving space for the consequences to unfold in their own time while I moved forward unbound, uncompromised, and resolutely free.